thanks for joining us here at Some Future for episode 18 of our podcast. We're your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey!
So we have a great show prepared for you guys today. On Present Futures, we will be discussing direct democracy and the good and bad of artificial intelligence and its implications for our society. On PaleoFutures, we will be discussing the novel and movie 1984. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing investing in India. And as always, we will have a prominent futurist as our guest. We hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in Some Future.
That's Some Future. Okay, so for my present future, I came across what I consider a positive movement in the in democracy, actually, which is really great. And I know, of course, we never sort of get political, and this is a futurist podcast, so we kind of keep that from the fray, right? We stay above that. But when we talk about futures is actually about political dynamics as well, right? So there's something in futures. It's called steep dynamics. So this is whether it's social, technological, environmental, economic, and political trends, or epistle, that we also use epistle too. Politics has a chance to take history to many different places. And, we discuss it sometimes a little bit on this podcast, especially when we speak to some of our guests, but we're in a kind of crazy time currently in the United States. So I think it's good for us to take a look at that. So I think we'll talk about the positive stuff in just a little bit, but I want to just talk a little bit about a meeting that happened here just a couple weeks ago. This was on October 6th, and the name of this headline is 20 of America's top political scientists gathered to discuss our democracy, and they're scared. So I'm like, yeah, rightfully so, right? But I mean, well, maybe not, right? Because again, we try to keep things as middle as possible here, but so what was the reasoning around this? And so essentially, what they're saying, these 20 folks got together. This is based off of empirical data too. So there is a research firm. It's called Brightline Watch, and they've been doing some surveys, some U.S. Democratic surveys, where they polled people asking questions on are elections conducted without fraud? Does government protect individual rights to engage in unpopular speech? Does government agencies are not used to monitor, attack, or punish political opponents? And what we're finding out is that with this data that they're collecting, turns out not only do these political scientists actually not think that democracy is very strong, but the public feels even worse, right? So, and I think, you and I could say we're in America anyway, and really around the world, there's a real deep divide, amongst the left leaning and right leaning, and it's causing some disturbance in the democratic force, for sure. And whether we're on the side of Donald Trump, or whether you're on the side of the Democrats, or whether you're on the side of Marie Le Pen, or whether you're on the side of Macron, or when it comes to Brexit, I mean, there's a lot of destabilization, sort of happening right now, and I think it's good for us to sort of note this, right? And it's good to see this, or excuse me, it's not good to see this, but it's good for us to sort of understand that the democratic ideal is a hard thing to keep in, right? And so it's good for us to understand what are the mechanisms that could cause this, and these social scientists have uncovered some things sort of along the way, some things that we see, right? A lot of this is based in economics. So for the first time, Americans, and really kind of globally, even obviously in Europe as well, that there's no real positive view of the future for a lot of these folks. So in 1970, 90% of 30-year-olds in America were better off than their parents were at the same age. In 2010, only 50% were, right? not only, and so, as of right, people are just pessimistic. 64% of people in Europe believe their children will be worse off than they were. That number is 60% in America. So we're talking 6 out of 10 people. Okay, so there is some sort of weird thing that's happening, right? This economic instability. Maybe it was spurred by the the global financial collapse in 2010, and then we have this political polarization that may have always been there, but now we have the introduction of the internet, high-speed communication, fake news, which is also something we can talk to. Matter of fact, I think this is something that we should definitely talk about in a present future. That's a whole other topic. But I think we're not off the rails, but it's something to note that these prominent democratic, ideal folks that kind of study this stuff are paying attention, that this is very much kind of akin to what we saw earlier in this century, during the 1920s and 30s, during the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of nationalist socialism in Germany. So that's I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. It's just there is some parallels, and I think it's good to sort of understand that, and it's actually good as futurists for us to understand the mechanisms, whether it's communication and our inability to deal with all this information so quickly, like we were talking about with fake news, or it's these economic inequalities and it's causing disturbances with people's ideals, and so it's causing them to move and sway in these ways. So it's definitely, it feels weird right now. The vibrations are weird, and I don't know, Jack. I mean, what do you think is happening? Do you think this has to do with the economics more than anything? Does it have to do more with fake news? It's a combination. What do you think's going on?
I think that I agree with you in the fact that I think our society is becoming more and more polarized, on the left and the right. It seems you can't talk and have a conversation with anybody without offending them or having some sort of feelings hurts, and then the conversation stops. And the intellectual part of the conversation, where you're trying to understand each other and appreciate each other's beliefs, that just gets cut off. I couldn't tell you how many times I tried to have a conversation with someone. They accused me of being a Democrat, or they accused me of being a Republican, one way or the other, instead of, and I think part of that has to deal with an increasing amount of information. Like, I agree with you on the fake news that is being bombarded to people, and an increased, like that polarization of society I was talking about. But then there's an increased educational component. We're becoming more and more knowledgeable and educated. And what that means is that people also have, I guess, there's a stigma associated with education, that if you're an educated individual, then you believe that you're right, and you can pull up all these facts and figures to support your beliefs. And the fact is that facts and figures can be swayed. And so I'm always open to interpretation, understanding what other people say, and changing my beliefs. That's hard for people to do. But I think you and I, when we have these types of conversations, we can actually respect each other's opinions, because you and I tend to be on some different sides of the political spectrum. But that also means that we can really see it from both perspectives and give like a kind of a encompassing view.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I see that's happening in society. And I know you're going to mention what you think, what you've seen, what things are coming out of this.
Sure. So, for sure, what, like we were talking about, obviously information ingestion is really difficult thing to deal with. One thing that's coming out, and I think we'll have a present future to deeper discuss this, is the polarization done by this information deluge, this thing that we call fake news. And there is actually real fake news that's happening, where they can actually change somebody's voice, or I don't know if you've seen these YouTubes where they show George Bush's face, and pretty much artificial intelligence does a readout of his face. They're able to use just 10 minutes. All they need is 10 minutes of like your voice, and they can, of his speech, right? And based on the tones of a 10-minute George W. Bush speech, they can actually have him speak as if he's actually speaking about just anything. So you could see that this fake news stuff, which is starting in the verbal phrase, right? And so that's essentially what what we're saying with some of the stuff that comes out, whether it's from Russia or Ukraine or whatever you want to call it. There are people writing fake information that's being spread through social media, and that's causing people to be either uninformed or malinformed or disinformed, and this is causing issues. So in the future, right, there's going to be fake news where we're not even going to know if what George Bush or President Obama or President Trump or President Pence or whoever the heck we're going to, Macron or whoever you want to call it, Theresa May, that we won't even know if they're actually speaking. So this is a major issue, of course, right? And I think we need to pay very close attention to how we get the information in, and we almost need like some sort of certification system to ensure that the news that we're reading is correct and certified, but that also what we're hearing and seeing, right, is correct. So sometimes seeing is not necessarily believing, and we're going to have to figure that out. Now, I have seen this, and this is what started this idea, right? And so I came across this, came out just a week or so ago. Colorado political candidate promises to give his seat to an app. So essentially what this fellow does, his name's Camilo Casas. So if he's elected to the city council in Boulder this November, he says that he's not going to make any decisions by himself. So he said if he wins, he's going to give up his vote to this. Essentially, it's an app that he built that he thinks can help change government, right? So this is how it works. So if more than 50% of the people in his community vote yes on an issue through this app, Cassis will vote the same. So essentially, this is direct democracy in action, right? And so he's thought about the frauds part. So he's going to utilize some biometrics for verification for this. But what he's hoping this does is that this creates a direct democracy and or quote unquote liquid democracy where we can actually leverage technology to place the power amongst the citizens rather than the representative. So in some ways, the representative is just a conduit and or a facilitator of the citizens' direct actions. Now, obviously, we were just talking about the security issues, fake news, nefarious actors that are trying to propel, either internal to their own government or outside governments for their own favor. That the security obviously is an issue. So having everyone vote on an app, I think that is scary to everybody. But if it's a possibility for us to have smarter government, I think it's great. So I mean, it's a great idea. I think I don't know enough about liquid or direct democracy to completely understand that. And I think from what I've read too, and you may even be able to talk to me about this, that direct democracy actually might even be even worse, right? We have a system of checks and balances inside the United States. Sometimes the electoral college that the much squeegeed over, is that the correct thing that we do in the United States? That is a way that we're able to control the people not only voted for president. The fact that there are 2 senators per state, the fact that every person has every little region in America has a certain amount of members in the House of Representatives. The fact that there's 3 distinct levers of government. All of these things ensure that government moves really at a snail's pace because the founders didn't want us to go back and forth. So essentially what direct democracy would be doing, it would say, no, we're not going to do that at all. Whatever Twitter handle is blowing up this past week or so, we're going to go ahead and choose to do that because, that's the flavor of the week and whatnot. So, I'm not sure if this is the exact thing to do, but I'm a futurist. I got to stay open-minded and I got to say, hey, you know what? I think maybe just like things like in universal basic income, or us figuring out different ways of currency exchange when it comes to Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. Perhaps maybe doing small little projects like this, maybe in the small scale inside the city may work. So you can go ahead and tell me no if you want, Jack.
Yes. But of course, like usual, I'm going to be the pessimist here. So, but I did want to tell you. So that I read that article too, and I'd heard about this guy in Colorado. And his ideas are based kind of off of what there's actually a political party called Flux, which is it's a political movement, which actually aims to replace the world's elected legislators with new electronic systems known as issue-based direct democracy, IBDD. So it actually originated and is most active in Australia, but it's also active internationally, and there's a group that exists in Brazil and other places. But I kind of wanted to get into what direct democracy is, and then I'm gonna poo-poo it because there's a lot of reasons behind that. So there's what most experts agree. There's two main forms of direct democracy. There's participatory democracy, which emphasizes the broad participation of constituents in the direction and operation of political systems. And then there's deliberative democracy, which is where deliberation is central to decision making. That actually adopts elements of both consensus decision making and majority rule. It differs from traditional democratic theory in that authentic deliberation, not mere voting, is the primary source of legitimacy for the law. So if you look back, way back, we've actually had direct democracy in some form or another for thousands of years. The first form, obviously, which most people know of, was direct democracy that was in Athens, although that was not inclusive direct democracy because it did not include women, slaves, or foreigners. What basically this guy in Colorado is advocating is a form of direct democracy called e-democracy, which is using technology to have a form of direct democracy. It's actually interesting that there are several countries and groups that actually do practice direct democracy in one form or another in the world. If you look at Switzerland, they're probably what you could be considered today as the closest form of what you consider direct democracy. Their citizens have more power than what you would have in a representative democracy, or in case in our country, which most people think we're a democracy, but we're actually a constitutional republic. But they're considered what you would consider more having more power. In Switzerland, like there's a political level where citizens can propose changes to the Constitution. So anybody can. You have a popular initiative, or you can ask for an optional referendum to be held on any law voted by the federal cantonal parliament or a legislative body in like a municipality. And what's interesting is that it actually exists as well, not only in Switzerland, but in the United States. You can find towns in the United States that participate in direct democracy. They have town meetings where everyone gets a vote, and that actually precedes the founding of our nation by over 100 years. There's some towns in Vermont that do that. Okay, now I'm going to poo-poo direct democracy, and I'll hand it back to you, Chris, to debate me. But so I'm very, very against direct democracy, at least in what we can create it now. One of my concerns, obviously, is like what you were mentioning, was the creation of apps and the potential hacking of an app, or, how do you know that that's actually representative of the population? Until a quantum internet is created, an unhackable internet, I don't feel comfortable having an app that would do that. Also, if you look at the writers of our Constitution and the ones who signed the Declaration of Independence, John Witherspoon, he said, "Pure democracy cannot subsist long, nor be carried far into the departments of state. It is very subject to caprice and the madness of popular rage." And then even Alexander Hamilton said that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would not be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity. It basically what a lot of people would advocate, or say, at least who had my beliefs, would say that it's basically mob rule. And what the problem with mob rule is if you have a rule straight from the majority, it tramples on the rights of minorities. Because the majority really just wants to do what the majority wants to do. There's all sorts of things that people can be pretty messed up. I mean, if you look at, there was a recent poll that came out that said Americans are actually considering alternatives to democracy and would vote on alternatives to democracy. And I think in your article that you were mentioning, in 1995, 1 in 16 Americans supported army rule, and in 2014 that number increased to 1 in 6. So a direct army rule. Yeah, there's a lot of things that I just really disagree. I don't think we can do direct democracy. I think it would be a danger to our society. I do think we need a new system, and that I think that we are capable of creating a better system than what we have now. But I think that involves abolishing political parties, having limits on spending for elections, all forms of spending, so that anyone could run, having referendums like what Switzerland does, I think that's awesome on important issues that we need to make sure that everyone can have a voice. I mean, those are my points, man. I'm back to you.
No. You're, I tell you what, Jack, the one thing that I could say, and it's great about being and living in America and living in many Western democracies, is because we're able to do this. We're able to speak about our government, and not necessarily all negative, somewhere in between, right? It's everything's a mix. And, I think that's extremely important. So, I think I'm going to choose the fake news. I think in the future, it's something really important for us to talk about. And I think I need to flesh that out a little bit more. But do me a favor, folks who are listening to us, do your part. The only way that we can have a democracy is for you to know the stuff that Jack and I are talking about. So, speak with people that are dissimilar to you, learn as much as you can, try to go back to your facts as much as you can, go back to the baseline, right? I think sometimes we get lodged in opinions versus the facts. And I always like to start with the facts. And that's great about this podcast is we start with facts. We start with figures. We don't go to opinions. And then we base our opinions off of what we learn. And I think sometimes in the current dialogue, we kind of start with the opinions and we find the facts that move to our opinions. And I think that's wrong. But regardless, the fact that we're engaged and we're talking about democracy, and I think this is our longest segment we've ever done. So that means that, it's something that is really fruiting and it's wonderful. But if you want to be a part of a democracy, the best way is to learn and know what's happening in your community, what's happening in your region, what's happening in your country, and then be able to speak openly and honestly with your fellow citizens for better and more perfect union. It's super important. So get out there, guys, and be a part of it.
So, Chris, I'm going to piggyback off your idea here for a second and about
how dare you?
Yeah,
how dare you?
Changing of society. So, artificial intelligence (AI) has been in the news a lot recently. We've also talked about it a lot on our show, and we've had many guests on the show like Zoltan Isfan who have discussed it. We've talked about opinions from noted futurists like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil, and we've discussed the singularity, which is the point where AI evolves to a point that we as humans cannot even fathom what it may be. And we've contemplated what that may mean for the continued existence of humanity. However, one thing that we haven't talked about is how AI could bring us to a better and more just society. Now, this isn't meant to be a commentary on society as a whole or some far future after 2045, which is, when Kurzweil suggested that we'll have the singularity. No, it's not some far off thing that we can't contemplate. Instead, I wanted to see what could happen in our society from now until about 2025, or even earlier, in a time when we are able to create an intelligence that is increasingly intelligent and is still built for the best interests of mankind. One reason I'm bringing this up, Chris, is because, as you know, I think we're both political junkies. It's been making the news recently that a politician running in Colorado, like you said, is planning on making all of his decisions based on that app. The app is designed for that liquid type democracy where politicians are asked to vote on what their constituent wants and not what they desire. Which some people argue that it's more difficult to corrupt, for them to be corrupt, or have sort of special interests or big business making up the rules. Honestly, this is something that I've been thinking about for years, Chris. I mean, imagine if all politicians did this, where all of their decisions, what if all of the decisions were decided by their constituents? Wouldn't that in essence be a form of, like the direct democracy that we were talking about, where every voice actually matters and the government truly says that they reflected the will of the people? What's amazing, Chris, is that movements like this are spreading more and more, like we mentioned in South America, Europe, America. Other places are suggesting that this may be the future of government. Obviously, that I disagree with that, but and I think that there's a flaw in that. And I think that if you look at artificial intelligence, you could see that. So obviously what we consider both people and apps, like the app this Colorado politician is suggesting, they're hackable. People are hackable by, money, bribes, and, other things, and apps are hackable in your traditional sense of hacking. So I think that, there's a number of things that could influence both a human and an app. Now, I think that, while that it's a great idea, until we have that unhackable quantum internet, like we mentioned, there's no way that we can truly have a true democracy, a true direct democracy. So there's an interesting thought here. Some people argue that the United States is a republic for a reason, and that if you left voting up to the masses, you might get something along the lines of the movie Idiocracy. I don't know if you've ever seen that, Idiocracy, where truly poor decisions are made by the uneducated or uncaring masses, and that one person is needed in order to ensure such things as minority protections, etc. And so that's where I'm leading all of this back to AI. So imagine a world in which this technology is applied to a robot who everyone agrees is programmed to truly take in these answers and vote for what people vote on. And better yet, is designed to come up with the outcome that benefits the most people in a truly democratic manner. So essentially meaning that we recognize that we as a species, we're flawed, and with our biases, and we create something, an artificial intelligence that recognizes this in us and instead is designed to help us overcome this in order to create a more perfect world. So imagine a world where we have judges that judge based on the facts, police that act in the most ethical manner, and so on and so forth. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's already kind of happening, right? So there are bots that are currently doing legal research and saying here's the possibility of what you should do, and if this crime occurred, or if all this occurred, right? It goes through all the case law. Based on the case law, it says, okay, this is how much this is based on this preponderance. We feel that this person should go to jail for this much, or there could be issues, right, with that case. Same thing when it comes to healthcare. So we're putting things in the systems, and while it hasn't come to completely fruition, IBM has been working on this for a decade or so. The ability for AI to make decisions is becoming better and faster every year. And so when you think about something like AlphaGo, which could beat the most complex game we have in the world, Go. And matter of fact, I just heard that it beat not only the human assisted, but it beat actually the complete computer as well. So we now have AI that could do dramatic things, right? From video games to being able to make decisions on legality and everything else. What people always say is, okay, but what happens when the program goes awry? What happens when it doesn't know how to make the correct assessment, right? So, for instance, we could have an AI that, and I think Sam Harris uses this metaphor all the time, that this AI knows how to build the best paperclip in the world, right? So it's going to create systems to build the most perfectly engineered paperclip. But if somehow that ends up being getting to the realm of biology, well, then it's going to turn us all into this, engineered paperclip, sort of thing, right? And it's silly to imagine that, but that's what we're saying, right? So who's behind the programming? Who do we, what are the mechanisms that we put in front of this to ensure it works? What happens if something nefarious goes wrong? And keep in mind, we have an interconnected global system, not only an interconnected grid. We have maybe interconnected drone warfare, interconnected just the internet itself, right? So AI, it has to be powerful, it has to be correct, and it has to be fail-proof. And unfortunately, I don't think we even know how that is even possible, right? And we're already having these issues when it comes to our democracy, with people who are hacking democracy, people who are hacking bank accounts, people who are hacking possible grids. The future of terrorism very, very well may be electronic terrorism, and this is something to worry about. And it worries me, as it worries Sam Harris, as it worries Stephen Hawking, as it worries Elon Musk, that if we put too much power into AI over our society, that we may do ourselves we may not do ourselves a good service, and put us in a precarious position.
Well, what's crazy is that Elon Musk recently went out on a little bit of a tirade. There's actually a group out there who are trying to create an artificial intelligence as a god, and to worship it. And he was obviously he was completely against that. So I mean that's some of the negative parts of society. We're just now beginning to talk about that. That unfortunately, what's happening with technology is that the pace of technology is growing faster than what we can think about, pass laws for, or decide if it's in our best interest as a society to do this. We're already creating these things without these rules in place, without the rules of robotics, without the rules of AI, do no evil, can't harm humans, things like that. So, I mean, my question is I guess for our listeners, are they willing to have what we would consider a robot judge, pass down a sentence on you? I mean, if you commit a crime, would you be willing to have a robot attorney defend you? What about having employees at the IRS who you couldn't trick or fool, and who would follow American laws down to the T? What about machines that take over our economic trading machines and so forth to make them most productive? And we have less and less of our lives needing to be managed. Are you comfortable with AI taking over these parts of our society and our lives? Like you were saying, we're getting closer and closer to these types of technologies. They're in the works. They're being created. We're dealing with these first sets of computers that are making these impactful and long-lasting decisions on humankind, whether it be a police robot, the autonomous vehicles where, you had to, if you're having an accident where it has to make that split instant decision, do you hit the old lady or the group of teenagers? What if we had an intelligent robot that acted as mankind's babysitter, like I was suggesting, who would protect us from ourselves, who would be our politicians, who would be the judges of our society, and doing things, and I like to look at that almost in a positive light, is if we can get it right, what it could mean for our society. You don't have a biased judge who may be racist against, African Americans, secretly, you don't know. And he passes a sentence that was more intense than anything else. Take out that racial bias, take out the sexism, the hatred that, that we inherently have in ourselves as humankind. What if we had something where, a robot, our robot politicians, if all countries had robot politicians, and they all decided, hey, you know what? It's best for humanity. Let's get rid of nuclear stockpiles. Let's just get rid of all nuclear bombs. We as a human society would probably never do that. But what if we had something that was acting in our best interests? And, if we're able to create something more perfect than ourselves, that would be, a pretty awesome way to have equitable and level-headed decisions. So, I mean, is this the way that society is headed? I mean, have we, if this was created, would this be the best form of government? Or would, like Elon Musk say, if we give away our rights, then we become slaves to these machines? And, in what we would think would be a true democracy is actually a prison.
Yeah.
Idea of liberty versus, security.
The thing is, I think we have to be augmented by artificial intelligence. I don't think that we're going to have AI take over every facet of humanity, and I think too this goes back to our need to actually still be a part of the natural world, right? And to be humans. Now, of course, what Jason Silva says and other futurists say is that and what Marshall McLuhan said, human beings are the sexual organs of the machine world. When we download our brains into cyberspace and interconnect through our souls that way, well, maybe AI, we don't necessarily have to worry about death because we're not dead. We're not even material, anymore. But if we still want to be concerned with the meat bag that is humanity, we can't ever give up our humanity. Our feet still have to touch the ground. We still have to, respirate, in a good atmosphere. We still have to have a viable planet that allows us to ingest the protein and nutrients and minerals that we need to sustain human life. And sometimes it's best to disconnect from the technology world and actually connect with the soul that is living on planet Earth and the many planets that we may find around the universe. So I think it's important for us not to lose that humanity and to remember that AI is a tool, much like writing was a tool, much like sharp-edged rocks were a tool, and we need to be able to shape those tools for the better of mankind. Okay, so staying on the topic, geez, we're just all about the government here. The reason why I decided to pick this is PaleoFutures. Sorry, folks, I did not give you the proper introduction. So last time we talked about Philip K. Dick Right? Is that what? No, what do we talk about? No, I'm sorry. Pardon me. Pardon me. We didn't talk about. We talked about Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World,
Yeah.
and we were comparing Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World to 1984 and how they were kind of different sides of the same coin, perhaps, right? And real quick, for those who didn't hear that, 1984 is the dystopian novel written by Aldous Huxley about how we're all farmed in, hatched, and we're set to our certain degree, and we all take drugs, and we don't even realize what's happening
Right.
because the world is this, perfect place because it's subdivided and everything like that. And what's interesting is that if you juxtapose that against our PaleoFutures today, George Orwell's 1984, 1984 is a little bit different, right? And it's about a totalitarian government. So let's talk a little bit about 1984, sort of introduce it. So 1984, it was published in 1949 by the English author George Orwell. So it's set in Airstrip One, which is formerly Great Britain, and it's part of the super state called Oceania, and it's perpetual war. You have omnipresent government surveillance, public manipulation, and there's a lot of people looking at you. Big Brother is always watching you. So this tyranny is overseen by Big Brother, the party leader who enjoys this cult of personality, who directs, who and people are not even sure if this person is even real, right? You see these signs that show up, and behave, beware. There's thought police, and they're seeking out thought crimes to make sure that you're doing what you do, which is crazy. It's crazy, the parallels of what we have going on now, right? So Orwell, he invented this language in it called Newspeak, which really it just satirizes the hypocrisy and evasion of the state. There's something called the Ministry of Love, which oversees how people are tortured and how they're brainwashed. There's the Ministry of Plenty, which actually oversees the shortage and rationing, so it keeps people in line because they can only do so much. And of course, there's the Ministry of Peace, which oversees the war that's constantly happening, the atrocity that's happening, and of course, the Ministry of Truth, which oversees all the propaganda and historical revisionism that always happens as well. And that brings me to that ever present quote that George Orwell always says is, "Whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present now controls the past." So you're never going to be able to get through it, right? So being a paleo future, we always talk about how wow, there's this connection with the past and the future, whether we're talking about Minority Report, we're talking about Children of Men, we're talking about, I think we're going to talk about Blade Runner pretty soon, right? So we're always looking at the technology and, how this aligns. So I don't think necessarily that 1984, we have completely seen it, like in reality, completely, but from what I've been reading the last couple months, and certainly since the Brexit vote and what's been happening in France and maybe our own election, 1984 is on the minds of a lot of people in the United States and around the world. People are asking, are we living in 1984? Which was evoked by people like the New York Times author, or excuse me, columnist Nicholas Kristof, Glenn Beck, Edward Snowden has grounded some of his thoughts in the ever present, Google, CIA, everybody looking at the surveillance state and how that is sort of impacting the world. I know I just missed it. I wanted to see 1984 was on Broadway actually this summer, and with Olivia Wilde, and I know I missed out on it. I live right next to it, and it really bums me out because I heard it was actually really, really good. And of course, the thought of the Orwellian presence, right? It's a universal shorthand for anything that seems repressive or totalitarian. Totalitarian. So, I think we're a little early, maybe a tad early, right, in either the Trump presidency or any of these others totalitarian regimes that we have around here. There is some parallels, maybe not necessarily with Trump, but maybe Erdogan, certainly Vladimir Putin. There seems to be a rise in authoritarian type policies. You see this with the Filipino President Duarte as well. So, and what we know of history, being a good futurist, that history also comes in cycles. So there's a possibility of us leaning and gleaning towards this totalitarian direction, which is, sometimes spawned because of economic inequality and blaming other people, besides, folks internal to the push for the glean, right, of a new proper democracy in the eyes of those that are trying to fashion it. So, we don't ever take political slants here. I'm really trying my best not to. I think it's this as a PaleoFutures. I think this is an interesting one for sure, especially in our current times. And I think our audience should definitely take a look at it.
Yeah, man. I think you forgot to mention one country that I think of 1984. So I mean, if you don't know the story, I highly recommend reading the book or watching the movie. I like the 1984 version. It's a little bit more, I guess, modern for the average watcher. I think that, and I think of 1984, I think of China. I mean, I think, if I think about something that, where the news
Sure.
media is tightly controlled, they rewrite history. I mean, they just recently had a parade when they celebrated their victory in World War II. Like they had sole-handedly, single-handedly like delivered China from the Japanese. And last I checked, there was no like, so, there was, Mao existed, but he was fighting in the farmlands. He wasn't a major player in World War II. And it's what's interesting is that the party system in China reminds me of China and its communist party that rules the country with an iron fist. I mean, it sounds like what the Xi Jinping just wrote himself actually into the party's constitution, which basically he can now be president forever in China. So, he also they just had this, Congress where they talked about all the different goals of the party and things like that. Xi Jinping even said that he would continue to crack down on any signs of dissent. Under his rule, Chinese authorities have restricted the ability of citizens to criticize the government online. They've hit NGOs with suffocating government regulations. And like actually during his speech, he suggested that there was more to come. That pledging, he pledged enhanced internet censorship to clearly oppose and resist the whole range of what he considered erroneous viewpoints. So if you know the story of 1984, it sounds like the very beginning of that.
Yeah.
It reminds me, so as a futurist, if you consider yourself a futurist, you love technology, but you also fear technology because you fear what it could be used for. Technology is a tool, and it's like a hammer. A hammer can be used to create things or destroy things. And that's kind of what I can see what China's doing with technology. They're using all of these technology methods to control what the people are thinking, to monitor people. And I mean, just like in 1984, where people just vanished and disappeared and they became like unpeople or something like that. That's what China does. Like if you looked at what was happening in Hong Kong, like with the yellow umbrella movement, like people disappeared. Some of them never were heard from again. And some people were like, there was a pretty wealthy like bookseller who disappeared. He owned like a book company or something like that, or whatever. Disappeared, came back, like 2 years later, and wouldn't talk about what happened. But then he all of a sudden had changed his views, and like that's exactly what 1984 does. And that's what I'm fearful for, because China says that they want to be the standard for emerging, economies. Like they want people to imitate what they're doing. And that's just scary because, obviously in the United States, we have a lot of issues. There are some things like the fake news or the news media that really isn't a news media anymore, that really doesn't do anything, such as investigative journalism are very few nowadays. But at least we still have that. In China, it since the party has been existent, it's never existed.
Yeah.
It's scary, man, and that it's only going to get worse as technologies improve, where they can monitor people from their television sets, like what they did in 1984. There were screens everywhere. Reminds me of cameras that are everywhere, watching people, interpreting. And if you have an artificial intelligence that can report people for any sort of slight infraction, then you can truly control a people, and that's scary.
And you could say that that's what we currently have now, whether that is Facebook having, Facebook has what, almost 3 billion people. I mean, Facebook is, the size of half the planet. And there's there's 10 to 20,000 engineers that have access to the likes, the needs, the wants of those folks. Google and its reach, not only collecting the needs of the information, but what are the potential thoughts and the feelings behind it? And in fact, I think I saw a report that Google could figure out what was the most racist county in the nation based on the search. What are they searching, right? And you could sort of tail and supposedly that they may even been connected to certain parts of our presidential election because of their interconnectedness to data. The fact that Amazon is collecting what we're buying and our buying patterns and who this is, right? And, so we're in this era of big data. We're in this era of understanding what the populace does, and on top of that, too, we're gonna layer AI on top of that. Also, we're gonna have more sensors than ever before with the advent and and ascent of the Internet of Things, as well as a surveillance society. By the way, the United Kingdom is completely surveyed. There's more. I think I don't know what the exact statistic is, but there are more cameras, I believe, in the United Kingdom than people, and this is in real time. So we are living, like you said. It's not just China, but even in our Western democracies, quote unquote democracies, there is a lot of this Orwellian interconnected society stuff going on. And, people don't always trust the government. People don't always trust the private sector as well. So it's something for us to look at, right? It's, are we going to be thought policed like China? By the way, we never speak about that, right? We always talk about China in terms of their economic output and the fact that they're creating solar, panels everywhere, and their fact that they're doing great at the Olympics or whatever, right? And then we just kind of gloss over the fact that you're right. They live in this totalitarian government that looks in on them at all times, right? But I think sometimes we need to look inside of ourselves and inside of our own democracies. That's why we have to be careful with AI. That's why we have to be careful with a technology like Facebook or the power behind those big vendors like the Googles and the Amazons of the world. We have to make sure that they're using our data properly. We have to make sure that we have a little bit of autonomy amongst ourselves to make sure they don't not only affect democracy, but affect society in nefarious and or just slightly negative ways, right? People don't want to feel like there's somebody always on them, right? People don't want to feel in fear. They want these technologies to augment their lives, but they don't want these technologies to drive their lives. And they don't want their government to drive their lives, nor do they want, private industry. One thing, right? I think it's always, some of my friends, the government's so terrible, and government, the government's us, right? We're the government, okay? And yes, I believe the government sometimes goes astray. Sometimes the government does great. It's sort of a mixed bag. But we can't forget the private industry is the same thing. We are the private industry as well. And the private industry does really great stuff, but also they do a lot of really bad stuff too. And they are using the same sort of data mechanisms. They are using the same sort of surveillance. They are learning about and using the technology of the day in order to create profit, sometimes to the detriment of the people that are actually spending the money. Yeah, on their products. So it's important for us to kind of take a hard look at George Orwell's 1984. Take a hard look at it and see, what are the things that we could learn, right? Do we need to ensure that we don't have we're not thought policed, and I'm not checking in on Jack to make sure he's not committing any thought crimes, that we're not speaking in double speak, right? And that we're not creating language to mask our stuff. It was interesting. I was reading some of the stuff on 1984, and this school teacher had done this exercise where he turned this project, this senior project, where he was having everyone give a speech, give a message, and then the message turned nefarious, and it turned that, and it was only like this teacher. This teacher is the best, and this teacher is the best. And then it got to a point where it was not even, after a week, it wasn't even a picture of the teacher saying this teacher is awesome. It was just a picture of his face and saying obey. And I think that is extremely powerful. When you look at folks like the tyrants of the Roman age going all the way to now, we need to be aware of the possibility of totalitarian nations, totalitarian people, authoritarian stuff. Like we have to be aware that this is a possibility, and we can't think that democracy is always going to be, because if we let go of it, powerful people, entities, actors may come in and do the same things that China or any of these other leaders around the world may do. So be on the lookout for that. Read George Orwell or watch 1984, and see if you can see this happening around where you're at.
All right, guys, for this episode of Biz Biz, we're going to do an interesting discussion. So instead of doing a suggestion of a stock purchase or a company, looking at a company, one thing we wanted to look at was the question of what constitutes a right. Because as we get further and further into technology and where technology can lead us, we are constantly facing these ideas of what constitutes a right and what the future may hold for things that currently cost money that may not cost money in the future. So a lot of this is being ballied around with the discussion on what the future of universal income or something like that. So that this is something that I'm bringing up, Chris, because I think that this is something we can talk about, and a lot of people aren't thinking about what can mean for society. So I'll jump into a couple of questions and we can just jump on it. So one thing that I think is going to be potential in the future is free energy. I think that energy is going to be free or nearly free, because as these advances in energy production continue, I think what our output is going to outpace what we require. If you look at some examples, there's the whole Elon Musk Tesla batteries, the home batteries you can have for your house, where you can actually sell energy back to the grid. And same as solar panels, it's allowing people to then sell energy back to the grid. So, what do you think is the future of energy? You think it's going to be free?
I think it probably should be free as best as we can. I think we're definitely running into an issue where you're digging holes into the ground and pulling out resources versus relying on renewable resources. We're finding that this is a real big issue, right? Not only for the ecology and environment of our planet, but just in terms of the resources you have to use to do that. So for a long time, whether it was solar, wind, tidal power, geothermal, all these technologies, they took a long while to kind of steady them, put them on a reliable path so we can go ahead and use them. So it made sense for us to stay sort of on the Harvard hydrocarbon energy kind of platform. So now that renewables are such a key source of power, and the technology is sort of catching up with the dreams, I think it makes a lot of sense for humanity at large, right? To have the ability to have renewable power everywhere. And because it's renewable, and there's a chance that we can go ahead and create whole solar power systems or wind energy and whatnot. We don't charge the sun and we don't charge the Coriolis effect or whatever that creates the wind either. We don't charge for that. and that's a part of being a human being. So I think you're absolutely correct. Perhaps maybe in 50 to 100 to 200 years, we'll have a right to energy. It'll be a part of the contract that humanity has with its citizens, and governments and citizenry at large will definitely hope and hopefully make sure that is what's going to stay.
What do you think is going to happen to companies like Shell and all these huge energy producers who have billions and billions of dollars in revenue? You think they're going to try to find a way to game the system, or sometimes government works really well, and sometimes government works really poorly in the fact that it doesn't protect its citizens. In fact, what it does is it protects the big interests of the big companies. So, I can't see. I can see a future where we have electric cars, all of this other stuff, and the kind of thing is, well, is that a right? Should that be a right that people should have access to power their homes and, power their computers and, access to free Wi-Fi? Is Wi-Fi a right? Is, a computer, internet access, is that a right? Because that's, someone who has internet access and has so much more knowledge at the tip of their fingers than someone who doesn't have internet access. So, that's the whole point of this conversation, is just to try to think about, will that be an actual, is free energy, will it be a right? Should it be a right? And it sounds like you think that. And
yeah. Well, I think and I hate to interrupt you here. We're going to get to even a larger question of, what does it mean to be a person on planet Earth? All of these things are coming together. Let's put the internet rights and the right to electricity. Let's just put that aside. Let's just concentrate on energy just real quick, right? We're in the midpoint. So as I was saying before, hydrocarbons, they seem to, we built the whole infrastructure. We have gas stations. We have, coal and natural gas fired power plants, which seem to be extremely effective at getting our electrical grid up, getting energy, all to everywhere in the United States. Lots of, obviously covering Europe. And of course, as these emerging economies happen, that's what they're using, right? They're using coal and natural gas power plant technology, not so much nuclear reactors, because we see what are some potential problems with those. But so our world is still steeped in hydrocarbon energy, right? Fuel systems and electrical energy. And renewables is making a push, right, to battle that. Well, who is investing in renewable technology just as much as hydrocarbons? Those, Shells, the Exxons of the world, right? They're hedging their bets because they see that, yes, this is actually a really desirable energy source. And it should be, right? We've had Gary Golden on the podcast. Gary talked to us about how solar power and energy power is you still need to have really great batteries. Our battery technology isn't here just yet. We don't have the infrastructure to have Tesla cars driving in the middle of Montana because there's not charging stations. I know the Tesla truck just came out, and what they're imagining is that you will have trucking stations where when you leave your origin and you arrive at your place where you're dropping off your load, they both will have charging stations and you'll charge. Well, that makes sense. But what happens if you don't have that, infrastructure or ecosystem in order to make that happen? You're not going to be able to do the trucking that you'd like. So we're still going to have a mix of this energy, and because of that, because hydrocarbons is based in a finite source that has a dollar sign, on it. So we're going to still be kind of in this mid-place world for a long time. As we build the infrastructure to be able to handle renewables on a global level. Now, is somebody going to put a, similar to what killed Tesla's big electrical, that big electrical tower he was going to have off Long Island, and he was going to allow for free energy to thrust itself all over New York City. There are some issues with that, but the concept is a high-minded concept. We should have free energy for everybody, and let's just power everyone as best as possible. J.P. Morgan, who was a backer of it, at least so goes the legend. He's like, okay, well, how do I put a meter on this so I can charge it, right? And it killed it. So I think, you could put a meter on wind energy. You could probably put a meter on the grid systems, the maintenance and whatnot. But then we start imagining how we create a true system where renewable energy and information and potentially as automation starts to take away jobs, do we have a right to live? We don't have the jobs to do we? How are we going to live? Do we have a right to the internet? It's being it's probably the focal point of our economy, and yet there's tons of places in sub-Saharan Africa that are completely disconnected. They're not a part of the global ideal. So I think there's going to be a lot of head scratching, not only in the hydrocarbon to renewable economies. I think there's going to be head scratching when it comes to, what does it mean to have to work in order to live, and what does that look like when it comes to the automation and artificial intelligence that's going to be gobbling up jobs. And if it's so cheap for us to 3D print housing, and is it possible then for the government to be able to step in and be able to create housing for people based off of renewable energy with free access to the internet? And how does that even work? We don't have the structures for that because we still have a free market capital-based system for much of the global economic world. So yes, this is extremely complicated, and no one is talking about it. No one really has any idea. What we're essentially talking about is we're going to reimagine the world, not based off free market capitalism or just the mix between the free market and social capitalism, socialism, which has buttressed the world for 500-600 years. It's an extremely hard concept to grasp, and I'm not sure there's a lot of thought leaders that are tackling it properly.
Well, you hit the nail on the head right there. Is post-capitalism. The idea of going beyond trade and commerce and earning $1, and that's the whole idea is kind of behind universal basic income. Is they say, well, what will happen when machines do all of our jobs? What will be left is you have to think of these. So many things have been considered rights going forward. Will these ideas and things will be considered a right? Because if we move that into the idea of education, so is education, we'd established, at least in the United States, that at least through high school, that is a right for all children to be able to attend all the way through high school. It's funded by the government. I mean, can we then apply that to secondary education and post-secondary education, and the fact that should it be a right to attend college? I think that is a huge discussion that came up in the most recent presidential debate. Mm-hmm. Is Bernie Sanders, I think, believes wholeheartedly that everyone should have the right to go to college, and and some people were vehemently against that, and some people were very for it, and we try to whole idea of politics in our conversations. At least we try to give both sides a fair shake. I think that that's another idea that's maybe like what you said, like 20, 50 years away, where people will be really discussing, is a college education, is that a right? And then what will happen if that happens? Because if even with our our primary education system, it's not fair. And our college system could end up being that way. For example, so there is a school in my town that it is an elementary school, and it goes up to high school, but they charge a tuition. It's a private school, and their tuition is $60,000 a year. A year. Like if you're in first grade, it's $60,000. If you're in 11th grade, it's $60,000. So I don't know what you could be teaching a first grader that's worth $60,000. But that's the idea. Is can you really, when we have this discussion of what is a right, can something that is then equally distributed among somebody, can that really be considered fair? Can these rights be considered? Can you really be given a fair right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other things that we're not talking about either, and why this is such a fruitful discussion, the right to freedom and privacy, right? So, it's extremely important to be connected, right, to do very well in the information economy, whether you are a thought leader, whether you are, scraping the data off of the connected world that we live in so you can understand the buying thought patterns, or even facilitate the service of capitalism. You're going to start impeding on people's privacy, and how is that right going to be affected by the business of commerce? Right. So I was just thinking about this as you were talking. The Declaration of Independence. It's we have the right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, well, what if that life is perpetual life, right? Like and allowing people to perhaps disconnect from society, commit suicide with their meatbag body, but yet use their mind, use their cognitive abilities, and be able to then port themselves into either an ethereal second life electronic based form, or even the ability to almost like the replicants or any of the other sci-fi that we watch, be able to transport yourself into different bodies. That's a life. I have the ability to do that life. What about liberty? We were just talking about the privacy issues. Do you have a right to freedom, even though we all actually need to be connected to so that the world can be a more fulfilled place, quote unquote? Then even the pursuit of happiness. VR is still a long way. It's still nascent, it's still growing, but I can definitely imagine a bunch of people, not only in America but in Europe for sure. The folks that are Western democracies that sort of have it easier than the emerging economies around the world. I have no doubt that there will be VR addictions. I think there will be VR, issues where people will not want to escape that reality, the virtual reality world, and it's already happening in Japan. I don't know if you know that these concepts of these men or these young men, they're aged 19 to even in their 30s. They don't leave their house. Some don't even leave their bedroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're either not doing anything, right? So they're facilitated by their parents, which is another societal issue. But also, they're not interacting with society because they're completely connected to a virtual world. They have virtual girlfriends, virtual friends. They're gamers. They're stuck, and they don't leave. Their domicile. They're not connecting with humanity the way really we thought that the internet would allow us to do. They're disconnected rather than being connected while they are connected, which is a paradox in itself. So I think when it comes to rights and us understanding it, the digital ethicist will have a lot of hay to be writing about. You and I will be probably a part of that conversation for the next many decades to come, because the next evolution that Jason Silva says, the technology evolution that's going to take over humanity, it's going to set up a lot of queries that I think Plato and Aristotle and all the other, the great philosophers of our time would definitely, they'd scratch their heads as well. Like, okay, what does this all mean when we have interconnected brains? What does this all mean when we can live in different consciousness levels? Whether it's a VR land or something even more visionary and insane. So, yeah, I think this is a really fruitful, interesting topic.
Well, let me ask you something real quick, and I don't want to go on too long with this segment, but one thing that I brought this up is because I wanted to think of things that right now that we consider that we pay for now and that may be considered rights in the future. We've talked about energy, we've talked about education. Maybe transportation is out there. The right for free transportation. Obviously, you need to be able to get to your job and or be able to travel somewhere. We could say that. One thing that I look at is, and I know I've brought up Star Trek a couple of times, but in like a lot of the creators who created Star Trek thought of, and they even say it in the shows, like Star Trek is like the paradise. It's like the the universalist paradise that free energy, free transportation, free all of this. Well, what else do you think might be considered, moving forward? Is it going to be free in the future, or be considered what I said, a right? The idea that it is inherently, every human being should be capable of getting this at any time, and it should be justifiably as equal as everyone else.
Yeah, I think probably sustenance down the line, as 3D printing becomes more available, that having access to that. One thing we haven't brought up is, how about the right to a clean environment? We haven't discussed that. That's, I think right now, you may have seen these. There's some teenagers that are suing the federal government because they're saying that they have polluted their planet. I think that's extremely interesting. You can't live in an environment if it's toxic to you. I mean, good luck trying to live on Venus. It's very difficult to do that. And then some of the other things that we were talking about, the right to potential digital privacy or not privacy, the right to be able to pursue your happiness even if it kills you. I think that's particularly interesting. Like I was saying, when we layered technology on top of the last part of our evolution, it's a completely different mechanism because it goes in different ways. The tree of life that has spawned human beings on planet Earth has very specific rules, right? You have to be able to you had to be able to put carbon in in your body of some sort. You have to be able to, as I was saying, live in a clean environment. You have to be able to be free from danger. That's why we started having caves, started living in tattered, unit societies, and then as agriculture and commerce grew, so exploded, quote unquote, civilization. Well, now that you layer this technology, interconnected technology, plus all the different things that we talk about on this podcast, that separates humanity from the Earth layer a little bit. And that means, and we're talking even galactical changes, right? When we go and enter new worlds, when we travel in star systems, when we're on spaceships, we're not talking about the familiar Earth reality that has allowed me and you to exist, right? We're talking about completely different things. And this is something that Plato and David Hume and Adam Smith and John Locke and all these other folks, they couldn't imagine what human rights were when you can now have an interconnected tribal drum that can communicate. And that's actually very helpful for folks that are talking about rights. What a better vehicle for speaking on and understanding the rights of your fellow human being by having an interconnected dialogue, which full of people that are completely unlike you. I mean, it's very powerful tool. However, now that you're connected, now that you have this connected world, how does that work? Because it's so foreign to us. I forgot what that number is, but it's you only can really know 150 people, right? Well, now, I mean, people have, like, Kim Kardashian has 100 million or 50 million Twitter followers. Some of these, Dan Blazarian, Instagram king, 40, 50 million people. Silly music videos have the power of changing billions of people's lives. It's an extremely exponential, crazy thing that we're doing now, and we're creating a hive mind and figuring out how rights work in this hive mind sort of scenario is extremely important. We haven't even talked about how this connected world is going to be that much more impacted by things like augmented reality, which could show whether we're lying or not, what sort of realities we can live in, what sort of rights do we have when we're in virtual reality space. Do people have the ability to hack into your virtual reality and cause nightmares, which cause emotional issues in your reality, right? So this is wow. Like, there's just so much to tackle here. Yeah. We've been talking for almost 25 minutes, but this is important. And I think even for FizBiz, right? Even for businesses have to have the ability to be able to balance the necessary privacy concerns that customers have with also their needs, which is understanding their customers better so they can serve them better, so they can be better, do better jobs at commerce. And it's going to be interesting to see which companies do a better job at stewarding that. And I think what you see now is there's actually a lot of companies that aren't doing that very well. Facebook, there's a big, huge issue that we had during the 2016 election. There still is, quote unquote, Russian hacking and or information warfare that's happening. I just saw over the weekend, there's this really insane Elsa Gate where this weird cartoons are being put on YouTube, and it's these like Spider-Man and Elsa and Mickey Mouse cartoons that are very cute, but they show these disturbing like violence and people going to it's bizarre. But what that is, is
100%.
that's right. It's information warfare, right? So do children have the right to be safe when they're on, they're on YouTube? Well, here you have, I talked to my friends and they're like, yes, this exists. I have to not have my kids look at YouTube. And do we create some sort of, worldwide legislation that says we have to remove this sort of information hardware down? Because what was really interesting about that is that this is geared for little children. So you have 2 to 5-year-olds that are watching this mindless violence, and how is that going to impact them going forward? You might have maybe not a generation, but if you have 1,000 to 2,000 different people across the United States or any other place around the world that have been changed and turned into psychopaths because they were imprinted when they were 2 or 3 years old of this disinformation techniques from whoever created this, that's an extremely dangerous way of changing a society. So wow, I mean, it's just technology has completely, it's going to affect us for a very long time. I think we need philosophers, lawyers, public policy people more than ever before. And this stuff, it takes a lot of head scratching to figure out how do you balance the connected world with the rights world, right, of being a human being and having a sustained and full life as best as you can. Okay, great. So for the Some Future interview segment, we have Dr. Peter Bishop. Dr. Peter Bishop is a still professional futurist, and he's a retired associate professor of strategic foresight and the former director of the graduate program in future studies at the University of Houston. Now, Dr. Bishop runs a futurist organization that teaches the future. And so their belief is that students of any age can learn and think critically and creatively about the future. This organization is called Teach the Future. Sounds, fairly perfect. And they provide free teaching material and support for educators who want to teach the future, contract with educators who want to develop teaching material, advise schools that want to incorporate futurist thinking in their curriculum, and connect like-minded educators who want to learn more about teaching the future. So this is perfect for the Some Future podcast. Thanks so much, Dr. Bishop, for agreeing to join us.
It's great to be with you, Christopher. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
You didn't say the fact that you graduated from the University of Houston program. Come on now, gotta keep the Cougar brand going, can't we? Huh?
Go Cougs! I do say it a lot. We do have a lot of UH guests from time to time. I don't want it to be a nothing but UH because we got a guy who went to the University of Georgia on the other line as well. But yeah, for sure. Thanks for reminding me. Love my UH futurists out there. Go Cougs, like I said. So, I think starting out, I want to know, why should we even teach the future? Like, what's so good about learning about the future?
Let me ask you a question. Why should we teach the past?
So what I would say is I learn what can happen in the future by learning about the past. That's my
if you make
thing.
And you're a futurist though. You make that application very directly. Most people learn about the past and they go, well, okay, it brings up, it's nice to know when Pearl Harbor was, and it brings up coffee conversation, but do people really need a reason to study the past? So the reason I ask that question is that it is assumed, it's a default in the curriculum. Well, of course, every school in the world has to have a history department. Every student, most days, most years, particularly in their K-12 experience, is taking a history class during the day, and it's shot throughout. Now, history has been around as a discipline for, believe it or not, about 2,500 years. It was invented in Greece by a couple of people who decided to describe the past not using myths and legends, not using stories of gods jumping out of Mount Olympus and interfering in human affairs, but as it really was. And that was really the first time that people were writing history as we think of it today. And now after 2,500 years from now, I hope the future is just as much a default subject in schools as the rest of the time. The second question, of course, is that none of us, though some would like to go live in the past, none of us can really do that. We haven't invented time travel yet. But The purpose is to get ready for a trip that we're all on, a journey we're all on, a journey that involves change into the future. While we can't tell you what's going to happen, we can give you the tools, the thinking styles, and some of the resources to be able to not predict, but anticipate. Get ready for it. I like the concept of anticipation. It's like a tennis player waiting for the serve. They don't know which way it's going to come, but they are prepared for hard to the left, hard to the right, all of those kinds of things. And anybody who is going to do anything needs to be able to anticipate the future. But we're all doing it basically out of gut instinct. Nobody has ever been taught how to do that. Nobody has learned how to do that. And while it's not perfect and it's not magic, I do believe that having education and training in a particular skill improves one's performance. So being able to anticipate and then finally influence the future is really what work is certainly about, and a lot about life as well. And so we should be sharing that skill with students, just like the skills of math and writing and language and all of that. We should be sharing that skills. And you and I know what those skills are now because we've been to school doing it. Most of the population doesn't know what those skills are.
Yeah. So, well, this is perfect then, because this leads me right into the how, right? So we know the why. We know that it's important for us to be able to, like you said, anticipate what's going to happen so we can be prepared. But how does one even think about teaching the future? You know, Jack and I, we explore just about every topic from economics, political intrigue, the future of technology, sports, culture. How does a teacher, you know, who teaches not only elementary, but going all the way up to the university level, how do we teach the future?
Well, it'll be hard to fit a whole master's degree into this 40-minute podcast, so let me try to abbreviate what goes on. The first thing we have to do is focus explicitly on change. Change is something that we're all experiencing. It's in the news every single day. Innovation and adaptation and all that stuff in business and in life is just job one in the world today. And yet change is rarely brought into the curriculum as an explicit subject. You'd think that would be crazy. I did a study. I looked up the top 10 sociology textbooks in Amazon a couple of years ago, looking for how much time they spent on social change. You'd think sociology was created to study society and changes in society. Turns out that there were 10 top textbooks. Each one had one chapter on social change out of about 15 chapters, which is a fairly small amount. And believe it or not, it was always the last chapter. So tell me how many teachers actually get to the last chapter. I mean, people are cramming for exams. The teacher didn't cover every chapter equally and basically says, oh yeah, there's a few other chapters which you can read over Christmas break. Well, come on now. Nobody's really learning much about change. So the characteristics of change then lead to how do we think about the future? And thinking about the future, the blinding aha for me was that we make a fundamental assumption about the future is that it is a singular time. It is one future in a whole host of many futures, one of which is going to be the present day. And in that sense, we're making a huge mistake. While the future, when it becomes the present, may be singular, and that's a philosophical discussion we could have, it is also true that while it is in the future, there is no one future. So what's everybody trying to do is basically figure out which is the one when there is no one. And so it's a waste of time. And it's not very accurate. And it doesn't do very well. So it's a fundamental assumption. So we think about three different kinds of futures. There is one special future out there, which is if you take all the forces at play today, just like in physics, all where they're headed, the momentum of change will carry us to a place. If you throw a log into a river, it will end up somewhere. Now, if it's a big delta like the Mississippi Delta, it may go down one channel or go down another channel, but you use all those forces and say, this is the channel that it is more likely than any of the other channels. And that's when people stop. They say, oh, that's the future. I've done the analysis. I've put it in a spreadsheet. We've got a computer model. That's the future. What they don't realize is that they are making assumptions about that one future that may or may not turn out to be true. Some of those assumptions, in fact, can be quite shaky. like every trend that we analyzed is going to go on and continue for the next 10 or 20 years. Well, come on, some of them will. We believe the world's population will be multiple billions in another couple of 10, 20, 30 years. But will technology trends continue? Will political trends continue? Will economic trends continue? Well, wait a second. So what are you doing using this one trend and then saying that's the future if in fact it's possible to challenge those assumptions and give good reasons, not just to say, oh, it might change. Well, of course, everything might change. But what are your reasons for it changing? What could you say to challenge that assumption? And if you get a successful challenge, now you're developing alternative futures, which are called scenarios. So we have expectation, we have the expected future and a whole bunch of others. And the expected future is even a scenario because it's not guaranteed. It's just the result of the logical extrapolation of the past through the present. The third future then is, well, those are the futures that are happening in the world. What are we going to do about that? Do we like that? Any of those alternatives? Do we like some more than others? And therefore we come up with the third future, which is our preferable future, the future that we want to see happen, and the future that we will commit time and money and our talent to try and bring it about. What people say, it's kind of bend the trajectory of the future towards the preferable. And so we generally teach the future as three types of futures. The expected futures, which is a result of logical analysis. The alternative futures, which are the result of critically thinking about and challenging that expected future. And then our values and our preferences and our aspirations that creates then which of those alternatives do we prefer and which ones will we work for.
And so, Andy, I have to ask you, if I know that you've taught
Dr. Bishop,
a lot of
Peter.
Peter,
it's okay.
please, yes.
Andy's the new one.
Often confused.
Peter, sorry. So my question for you is, what is the most important thing that you teach to students about future studies? If I know you've taught lots of different groups of students, what is the most important thing that you think that you can convey to them?
There is no one future. And secondly, that they have influence over the future, not the future of the world particularly, some people do, but their own future in an area we call the sphere of influence, so that they can affect their own life quite a bit, their family, their community. If they're in a workplace, they can affect that workplace and what that workplace does in the world. So to empower students to, first of all, get them out of this mistake that I'm waiting for the future to occur. There are only multiple futures. There is not the future. And lastly, to ask them to employ agency and empower them to try and bend that trajectory towards a more preferable future. Those are the two most important things. I know I'm a college professor, so I always have to answer more than one. You asked one question and I gave you two answers.
Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for, right? So, you were talking about that. You were a college professor. You were a college professor for decades at the University of Houston, helping lead, young futurists out there into the world. But now Teach the Future is really an educational foundation that is teaching everyone, including, as young as elementary. So, first of all, how is that going, by the way, that enterprise? And how is teaching college students and graduate, students who may be, in their 20s, 30s, or going even into their 50s and 60s, versus actually teaching, the youth?
Well, first of all, we're coming up about 3 years old officially in next January. So you have to, first of all, I taught about change. I taught about creating change a lot in the UH program. And so I went into this eyes open, realizing that I was trying to influence one of the most insulated and deeply conservative institutions in our society, that being education, which I was a part for all of my life. I started school when I was 4 years old, and I didn't get out until I was a lot older than that, and just 4 years ago. So I realize how slow this process is, and it is very slow. Secondly, we're not so much teaching youth or young people about the future. We're teaching, to some extent, teaching teachers to put this into their classes, to put this into the curriculum. So we do very little direct teaching of young people, but we want to influence the teachers and the schools and the educational system to take the future seriously and put it into their curriculum. Now, we have to then, of course, teach them how to teach about the future. So those two things. We had recently a fairly successful summer here in Houston and in Dallas. We did 3 teacher workshops and probably served about 180 teachers. We did 2 summer camps and had about 130 students, and think of it. So that was fairly successful, and that's a model that we're now carrying forward. Our new job this year is to try and scale the organization so that it can serve more than 3 school districts and more than 1 city or 2. And so I'm really in the process right now of trying to build up an organization that's a real organization, not just basically me and a few other people trying to do this thing. So we're past the founder stage and trying to move into a stage where we work on real products, real services, earn real money, not for profit. We're still a nonprofit, but the business model I hope will be sustainable by offering services that teachers and schools and districts want to pay for.
So, Peter, I guess I have a question for you. Is can anyone be a futurist? Is there such a thing as a professional futurist?
There's both. Everyone we're all thinking about the future all the time. This is a natural human capacity. Is one of the talents, one of the inherent capabilities we have as humans to be able to imagine a different state of affairs. There may be other animals that can do that. They certainly don't talk about it, and we don't think it's very common, if at all. But since we can imagine a different state of affairs, we can prepare for it, and we can try and influence it. So if you're going to go on a trip, you're going to pack your bag, you're going to think about traffic jams, you're going to be sure you have your ticket, sure you have a hotel reservation. I mean, I've broken all of those rules in my travels over time, but nevertheless, it's what we're supposed to do when we're on a journey. So we're all thinking about the future all the time. My point is that since we have picked up what you might call a kind of quasi-scientific view of the future, which is to understand the determining forces like physics that produce the expected future, we leave school with that misimpression that that's all there is. Schools don't teach us how to influence the future. Schools don't teach us how to anticipate alternative futures, the what might happen instead, the what if question. So we're all thinking about the future, and to that extent, we're all futurists. What we want is that they begin to think about that and anticipate and influence the future using a slightly more sophisticated approach, which we know as professional futurists. Now, what's a professional futurist is a person, obviously with a degree, a person who's practicing in service of others or in trying to create a better world through advocacy, but also is using the tools and techniques that we teach in the schools and we write about in these books. I draw the analogy with financial management. We all have to use money. We all have a checking account. We all use credit cards. We all get loans. And it is amazing how abysmally ignorant people are of those things that every accountant and every person who's thought about it knows. Kids leave school now without knowing the interest they're paying on those credit cards and all the money that they're pouring into the credit card industry. So there is a movement in schools now to create something called financial literacy. Do you have to be an accountant to know how to manage your money as a consumer or as a citizen? No, you don't have to understand all those complicated rules. You do have to know more than what you're, walking out of school with today or what you're becoming an adult with today. So financial literacy is an attempt to give people the rudimentary tools to do a better job of managing their finances. We are trying to do exactly the same thing, giving people a better than average set of skills to be able to anticipate and influence the future.
So I wanted to go just a different route, still within, the teaching realm that we've been talking about. What I think is really particularly great about talking to you, sir, is that you've been teaching futures for so long. So you've been through many decades of understanding. You have to keep
mentioning the so long part, right, Christopher? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
But this is great because it means that you're somebody who can kind of take a look at future studies, not only in the present, but what it was like, right? What we were just discussing, looking at history and looking at the capabilities of futures in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and going into today. So what do you think are the biggest differences between, teaching the futures in the 70s and 80s? And what do you think perhaps maybe the future of teaching the future may be?
I'm one who believes that future studies itself has not really changed a whole lot in terms of its substance. I have to share an anecdote with you. I was rooting around the garage looking for some old papers one time, and I came across a piece of paper from a dot matrix printer. I don't know. You guys are young enough; you may not know what those are. They're the things that have all the holes down the side, right? And it had only 3 words on it: trends, events, and issues. Still using trends, events, and issues as 3 major forms of change, and they have different implications and they create different futures. So that stuff hasn't changed all that much. Draper Kaufman, Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Learning for Tomorrow in 1974. Draper Kaufman wrote a book called Teaching the Future in 1979. Most of the stuff that I'm teaching today, or we're teaching teachers about, is in that book. So the fundamentals have not changed. That the early theoretical work in the 60s and 70s, both in Europe and in the US, laid a tremendous foundation for that. And I took that foundation and turned it into a master's program at the University of Houston. I didn't invent most of this stuff. I learned it just like you learned it, just like we're all learning it. So that part hasn't changed a whole lot. Of course, the field is much larger than it was before. There are more practicing professional futurists than there was. We've actually changed the name of the field. Used to be Future Studies, and now it's Foresight or Strategic Foresight. There is a lot more education that goes on. There are now not 1 graduate program, but maybe a dozen around the world. Futurists are offering seminars, both public seminars, as we do at the University of Houston twice a year, and also public seminars in Europe and US and Australia and places like that. So, and finally, we have some legitimacy. When we were graduating students in the 1980s, which was a real low point for future studies. I mean, the future studies had its golden age in the late 60s and 70s. Change was everywhere. Civil rights and Vietnam and Watergate and energy crisis. You couldn't pick up a newspaper without having some brand new kind of explosion changing the future. We got to 1980, and I think with the help of Ronald Reagan, who basically said, okay, y'all need to calm down now. I'm going to take care of all this stuff. And the baby boom, which were the engines of a lot of that change and protests and whatever, became the me generation because they had to go to work. They had to support a family, get a mortgage, buy a car, put a tie on, blah, 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 blah. So all of that kind of fascination with change kind of went away in the 1980s. And then Berlin Wall fell down. And the internet popped up. And we were at war in Iraq. And we have Y2K, and we have the tech bubble, and we have the Great Recession, and we have 9/11, and we go on and on and on. So people now are saying, this future stuff is not quite as easy as kind of putting numbers into a spreadsheet and figuring out where we're going to be. We need to have a different approach. So I think there's a respectability now. During the 1980s, we told our graduates, do not put the word futurist on your resume or in your bio. That would be a showstopper right away. Now it's a term that people understand. We're people who deal with the long-term future. We help people anticipate and influence the long-term future. Now, there's still a great deal of mysticism associated with it. There's baggage left over from fortune tellers and shamans and all kinds of things like that. But gradually over time, I mean, the Association of Professional Futurists, which is founded in 2002, now has almost 450 members. That, to me, tells us about the legitimacy of this field, that there are 450 people who claim to be professional futurists and, to some extent, are practicing it in their work.
So, Peter, I guess a question that I have is, so I teach business students strategic foresight. Can you explain to us, and our listeners, why is this important to teach in business?
Well, is business about the future?
Yes.
Of course. Well, that's why it's important. Now, the only required course in the United States is at the Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame. They teach a course called Foresight in Business and Society. They've got a great website. I urge you to get on there. And there is a video on there which answers that question. It's from students, it's from business people, it's from faculty members saying, we as a business school need to prepare our students for a different world than they're in today. And therefore, we're teaching this course. Every single of the 600 undergraduates at school take that course. So if you're dealing with the future, and almost everybody is, You need to do it well. You don't have to do it like a professional futurist, but you need to do it better than the misplaced assumptions that we generally learn about the future just by picking it up off the street.
What do you think we are failing at in terms of future studies? You know, and I don't know. This is not talking about job placement or anything like that, but is there a part of teaching the future or even talking about the future that you think we could do better, not only as futurists, but society in general?
Wow, what are we doing well? I mean, the list of what we're not doing very well is a lot longer than the ones we are doing well. So the consequences are obviously to think more long term, past next quarter. The short termism is considered to be, I don't have the data at my fingertips, but it's considered to be a huge problem, both in business and in government. People are basically working out their time and tenure and in their position or in the business they're in or in the political position that they're in until they're out. And then once they're out, the hell with them. It doesn't really count anymore. It's not on my watch. So therefore, I can, take short-term actions that have long-term, short-term good consequences, but maybe long-term negative consequences. So getting people to think more about what is the 10 to 20-year consequence of this? Should we really be thinking about this? We had leaders, not all of them, maybe not even a majority of them, that in the past did think about that, made investments. I was in a class the other day, and I realized that in our society today, I would describe our society, the leaders in our society, by the term cashing out. I looked up what cashing out means. It means turning intangible assets into tangible money. So when you cash out of the casino, you take those intangible chips, which are not worth anything outside the casino, and you turn it into real money. When you cash out of a business, you take not just the physical assets, but the brand value and the marketing and the brand loyalty, and you monetize that into your payout. And I believe that the leaders in our society today, and they've been doing this for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years maybe, they're cashing out. They're not investing in the future of our society. They're taking the money now, turning intangible assets, which is social capital, the quality of our people, the quality of our democracy, the quality of our technology and business, the quality of our physical environment, and basically not investing in it anymore in order to basically take the money for themselves, obviously, in this, therefore, the huge increase in inequality and the huge increase in political disenfranchisement and disillusionment with both the political and the economic consequences. Now, is teaching the future going to solve the problem of human greed? No. But if we had a citizenry that held people accountable to not just short-term hotspots, the bright and shiny things that business and government put in front of us, but are deep thinkers about the consequences of actions that they take, I don't know. That's about as aspirational and idealistic as I possibly could be. I'd probably have to shoot myself if I had any more aspirations. But indeed, since we do not deal with the future well, one of the consequences is we have citizens, and not just politicals. Remember, the businesses are depending on customers, and politicians are depending on voters. And unless we have customers and voters who, as people, understand the consequences of their actions and the actions of their leaders, there's no way they can hold them accountable. So I don't blame the leaders. The leaders are just doing, basically, it's a system, and they're doing what the system allows them to do, which in this case, I believe, is enfranchising themselves largely at the expense of most of the other people in society. So there's my political rant. You can cut it out of the podcast if you choose to.
No, we like to keep everything out there, so it's a really important thing. And this actually leads to another question along those lines, right? And this is more on the aspirational side, what we were talking about before. So I'm wondering, is there any goal or any sense in terms of understanding about the future? We've talked a little bit about it, but if you were going to give somebody, some things to learn or some special tools that they can use to not only be a futurist but be a conscious, informed citizen who explores the future. Now, and this goes beyond just the graduate level. I'm talking about even the elementary level. What are the tools and concepts that you think are important to embed in our minds so we can actually understand where the future can go and how to prepare our society there?
Well, that's a huge question, and I have a 20-page bibliography that I could share with you, and that won't probably answer it even completely. So there is a movement in education today, which I wholly support, and unfortunately, it is practiced more in lip service than it is in practice. And to give you the bumper sticker of that, it is to try and in schools cover less content and more skills. Not teach so much the textbook, but more what to do with that material. Now, you still have to know something. You can't be a doofus. You can't be ignorant. But you don't need to know as much as teachers and schools are teaching students about the Civil War, or about marketing, if not going to be a marketer, or about factoring a trinomial polynomial equation. We don't need to know that stuff. What we do need to know is taking the simple things and figuring out how to use them in our life and in our work, how to think critically, identify assumptions, and challenge those assumptions, with a great deal of courage, even in the face of other people, and say, well, what if that's not true? What assumptions are we making? The ability to construct alternative stories and tell stories about the future that are plausible and imaginative and engaging, so that people can say, yeah, well, I don't think that's going to happen, but it might. And if it does, what are we going to do about it? And then finally, of course, as I said before, empowering people to take some responsibility for their future and the future of their sphere of influence, their families, their communities, and their workplaces. If that were a short list of learning objectives in a school, that would be a futures-oriented school.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's just, and I hope that we can start embedding that sort of orientation, all across America, but maybe across the world. So I'm so glad that an organization like yours is actually doing that. Do you have anything to plug? I know. Do you have any events maybe coming out, or new work that you want to talk about?
Well, right now, as I say, we're in the planning phase of trying to scale the organization. I hope we will have a marketing campaign. We've had 2 school districts in Houston and 1 in Dallas that were partners with us last summer. I want to expand that number by a lot. I don't know how much we can do, but to do that, we have to have capacity. So we have to have people in those cities. I can't do that by myself. A few people working with me can't do that. So that's our planning phase. I do hope that by January 1st, we'll be able to start implementing that, both in terms of marketing and sales. And we have a new book coming out, though. I want to tell you about that. It's called the Futures Thinking Playbook, written by 2 of our colleagues. It's a middle school, basically, workbook, working through the tools and techniques that we've just been talking about. How to think, how to do research, how to think about the future, how to challenge assumptions, how to come up with an alternative future, and those kinds of things. So that will be coming out. It's called the Futures Thinking Playbook, and we're going to be promoting that within the next few weeks.
Well, fantastic. Well, Dr. Bishop, it's been fantastic connecting with you again. I really hope that this stuff takes off. Hopefully, it's going to find its way onto not only our podcast, but into young old and young educators as best as we can. And I can't thank you enough for this great conversation.
Well, I want to thank you guys. I know your millions of listeners will learn a lot from this podcast. We appreciate that. I'm aspirational, no problem with that. Let me give the website, which is www.teachthefuture.org. Very simple. And anybody's interested will find more information. Will find me and our team there, so they can follow up if they're interested.
Well, thanks so much, sir. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.